Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast, is for anyone interested in leadership and the wins, losses, and lessons of being an executive. We are two women who have successfully navigated C-Suite roles and are sharing our experiences. We will be bringing on guests to tell their stories and want to spark honest conversation and discussion, which may include swearing and lots of laughs. Join us on this adventure. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. I'm here with my partner in podcasting and many other things, Susan Sutherland, and I'm Juliet Clothier. And our guest today is John Newsome, and I'm going to introduce him in a minute. But I'm going to say hi to Susan first. Hi, Susan.
Hello, Juliet.
What's going on?
Well, as you know, I'm on the East Coast, staying with my brother, and my sister and brother and I are navigating my elderly mom's recent challenges. And boy, it's tough. She's 93. She'll be 94 in October, and has always been incredibly strong and healthy. And there's a combination of both physical decline. She has to walk with a walker. She has some pain in her legs. And then cognitively, she's struggling. And her lifeline has always been her friends and how she communicates with them via text and phone. And she's stopped being able to manage the phone the way she used to. So it's little things, but it's also essential things. So it's been a challenge. I know you going through some things like this too.
Yeah. Both my parents are they're 84, and they're, cognitively pretty good, but my dad has been struggling with, mobility issues and resisting things that we think he should be doing. And so, and he's not doing them. And I was likening it and then said this recently to someone. It's like a payback for my teenage years where, I didn't listen to him. So he's doing the same to me. So it's frustrating, but it's also their lives, and it's part of it too. So
I keep trying to remember that the most important thing is to lead with love, is to ask her what she needs and wants, and to really try to be heart-centered. But boy, the stubbornness. And it runs in our family anyway. Yeah, exactly. Like it's a natural thing for all of us in the family to be stubborn. But she's pretty clear she doesn't need or want help until she needs or wants help. So always trying to put that "I love you, what can we do for you" approach. So not easy to hold on to that sometimes.
Well, lead with love is a good segue into me introducing our guest.
Excellent.
Today's guest is John Newsome, founder of Public Equity Group, a nationally recognized strategy and management consulting firm that helps nonprofits, foundations, educational institutions, and social impact organizations advance equity and create lasting change. For more than 2 decades, John has partnered with visionary leaders to develop strategy, navigate transformation, strengthen governance, and build high-performing teams. His clients have included organizations such as the Obama Foundation, Planned Parenthood Federation of America, MIT CoLab, Seattle Foundation, and numerous community-based organizations working to advance racial, economic, and social justice. Prior to founding a Public Equity Group, John served as a consultant and management team member at the Bridgespan Group, worked as chief of staff for Oakland Public Schools, and led innovative public-private partnerships as vice president of U.S. initiatives for the Global Business Coalition on Health. He has also served as press secretary to Congresswoman Barbara Lee and has been deeply involved in advocacy efforts focused on civil rights, LGBTQ plus equality, and community empowerment. A Stanford University graduate with an MBA, an MA in Modern Thought and Literature, and a BA in Spanish Literature, John brings a unique blend of strategic rigor, systems thinking, and deep commitment to equity-centered leadership. Please join me in welcoming John Newsome. Hi, John.
Hi, Juliet. Great to see you. It's great to be reconnected.
Yeah, I know. I love this. I didn't add to the list of organizations that you worked with, which was the one that we met, which was Glide Foundation in San Francisco. And the work there, when you talk about transformational work, we were in major transformation. And And it was just great to have you there to help us think about what was next for Glide. So it was good.
Thank you. That's some of the most memorable work I've done. Meeting you was a delight, meeting that whole leadership team, and being compelled to integrate dance and song into strategy and management.
It was cool.
It really changed the way that I think about the world and think about my work. So, and who I am, how I show up. So super grateful.
I love that.
And Susan, great to meet you, and a lot of empathy to you as you navigate just the ups and downs of life and life's journey with parents.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm in it right now. And so it's top of mind and top of heart, of course, but I appreciate your wishes. Thank you.
Yeah. So John, we ask every guest at the beginning to just take us on their journey. And if I missed anything in the bio, please add that. And I didn't mention the midnight yoga, which is something I'm particularly interested in, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But please tell us kind of how you started on the journey, and did it happen intentionally or did it happen by accident, which sometimes is the case.
I wish it were midnight yoga. I no longer have the stamina to stay up till midnight. I'll be teaching tonight in my little town of Newburgh, New York, at 7:00, and it's a real joy. That has been a part of the journey, accepting that I'm not the best yogi nor the best yoga teacher, but teaching has really deepened my own practice. And I wanted to share that we can all practice even when we're not the most flexible or the best yogis. So more on that. How intentional has the journey been? I think it has, you said lead with love. I'm by nature actually a pretty snarky and dark person with a dark sense of humor, but rooted very much underneath all of that is a real commitment to love. And I think my journey has followed my heart. I have a very strong inner voice that has guided me, even when my head and my friends and my mentors said otherwise. And that took me, probably important to name what was the foundation. I was raised by civil rights activists. My father was very involved in SNCC when he was in law school at Howard. My mother was deeply committed to Black community, taught at the University of DC, committed to teaching Black kids. And I grew up with that grounding, but I also grew up in an elementary school that had an explicit multiracial, we called it multicultural focus. And my mother helped start a Spanish immersion program. So I grew up speaking Spanish. And then in 7th grade, I started taking Taekwondo. And so I grew up in this intersection of Black culture, Latinx culture, Korean culture, and in a very Jewish neighborhood. Going to so all of that is really important to my grounding. And when I got to college, I thought I should add I was a violinist. And I thought, I'm going to play the violin. I'm going to be a music major. No, that passed really quickly. No, I'll be a journalist. And I discovered I didn't really like the people working at the Stanford Daily. And but I really loved my Spanish classes. They were really nourishing and fun, and the people were great, and I was immersed in culture and literature. And so I chose that to be my major. And I left college with a Spanish degree and no idea how I would use it. And was lucky to be hired by my university to do community service programming, because I'd done a lot of community service through college. And that took me on this journey of working with community leaders and students and community organizations. I look back on this, it took me probably 10 years after graduating from college to look back on my history. And I realized, what I really enjoyed about studying Spanish was studying the Spanish Civil War and the human rights violations. And then going into work with community-based organizations was also humanitarian focused. So in hindsight, I was a human rights major. Mm-hmm. And I continued to do human rights work. And even through business school, which also looks like an odd stop on the journey, I went to business school because I wanted to help organizations be more effective and serve humans better.
So the business school thing jumped out at me when I was reading your profile, and it makes complete sense to me that you would go in that direction, at least to gather, I would call them the mainstream ideas about business and effectiveness and productivity, God help us all, as a way of putting those things in your toolbox. I'm putting words in your mouth, but it seems to me that that's an essential thing to be able to then pivot to organizations that aren't as traditional, that aren't as above the line or that fit into the norm box. And I'm just wondering what your experience was there as a person. How did you feel about your classmates and the environment you in, besides the, obviously intellectual component of getting new tools and carrying them forward?
It's a great question. I did not go to business school. I went to management school. That was my calculus at the time. I had worked for 3 or 4 organizations with really amazing leaders doing really hard work. Probably the best example is working on Capitol Hill for Congresswoman Lee, now Mayor Lee in Oakland. Mm-hmm. She's such a visionary. Her team was incredible. And the pace at which we were working with so few resources, trying to make decisions that were monumental for not just communities in Oakland and the country, but globally at like an insane pace. Like no information. And at the time, the Republicans were in the majority. This is the Newt Gingrich Congress. And you'd show up and you'd find out that today we're voting on a $100 billion HUD bill. And the next day you're voting on HIV funding. And the next day, and just constantly responding. And I was always wondering, how can this be done better? Right? What is the more strategic, more effective way to govern? Those are the kinds of questions that I was asking there and in prior roles. And so I begrudgingly realized, I think I need to go to school to learn these things. And I think it's business school. How horrible is that going to be? And I had stopped taking math in 11th grade. I never took calculus. And so I took a summer calculus class. Not really. I dropped out after the first week. I was told I had to learn to take derivatives. And so I made it through the week of derivatives. And then I was like, I'm out. This is terrible. And I just expected my classmates to be people very different from me and the people I had known. And on one hand, I cried every week through the first year of business school. I was learning new things that were a form of torture I had never seen. Econ was new, and stats were new, and operations was new. It was just brutal. And in fact, I was commuting from Palo Alto to San Francisco. I had a place in San Francisco because I knew I wanted to be, having gone there undergraduate and having worked at Stanford, I knew I wanted to be in San Francisco. Being an out gay person, no way was I going to live in Palo Alto again. And so I was commuting down every morning at 6 and coming back at 11 o'clock at night, and my grades were terrible. And I realized the only way I'm going to pass is if I take the only remaining window of time, which was my commute. And so I moved on campus, which was the one thing I did not want to do to get through that year. So it was really, really hard. And the people were incredible. They're some of the smartest, most passionate, most creative people I'd ever met. And that continues to be true. When I look back over my schooling, but also the networks that I'm part of, my favorite humans are my business school classmates. When I started a super PAC in 2017 to help flip districts from red to blue, the people who were the backbone of that super PAC were the Stanford MBA class of 2001.
Wow.
That is a great story and so heartening. So heartening.
Yeah, amazing. The idea of commuting that much and taking yourself into an uncomfortable place every day and just getting up and doing it is something not many people would thrive through. So I think it's so cool that you just found that workaround for yourself and like, I need to do this. I need to get through this. And how am I going to do it? And kind of also thinking about it on your terms. Like, I know I have this construct. I don't love the construct, but I'm going to figure out how to make that construct work for me. And I think that's such an interesting leadership lesson. I think just figuring that out, because I think a lot of us, and Susan, you were in a corporate world for a long time. I've been in mostly nonprofits or owner-owned companies, but having to navigate those types of corporate worlds or constructs where it's just there's so much uncomfortable, and just kind of being there with it. So I think that's such a anyway.
I think in every leadership journey, probably most of the time, if we're paying attention, there's that tightrope walking and tension of navigating things that we don't like, that we don't necessarily believe in, but see a path where we can have an impact. And there's that personal cost too. And that's exactly what I hear in the story of I was doing this commute. That was what gave, being in San Francisco was probably what fed your soul and allowed you to go to school. And yet that time was a trade-off you were making that ultimately didn't serve your academic experience. I want to jump ahead if I can. I'd like to talk a little bit, John, about how you toggled away from consulting and to being on staff at a couple of periods in your career. What was the catalyst for those two transitions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about this often. I used to lecture in a class at the business and ed schools at Stanford, and I would talk about, at that point, it was especially the most recent, say 20 years, 15 years of my career, and this in and out that really can look messy on the resume. There's a way of talking about my journey that is very nonlinear and very messy. And I can choose to tell that story, and I would walk them through all the ins and outs. And then I realized along the way that there's another way to tell the story that's much more coherent, that puts a kind of a wrapper around what I've done. And that's the way that I now choose to tell the story. So I typically say, I've been a consultant for the last 25 years. And that is true. What's also true is that I've left consulting to take in-house roles. And those in-house roles were incredibly enticing. And that's why I took them. Mm-hmm. And both of them were amazing until they were not. And then I fled. And so one of them was in the Oakland Public Schools. I left Bridgespan to go in-house. The chief of staff was just an incredible powerhouse, and was very ill. And so I took her role. And during this time of like deep transformation, community-based organizations were in partnership and sometimes at odds with the district as they were trying to reform and roll out a small school strategy district-wide. Oakland was one of the stars of the education world nationally. National funders had lined up to support. And I thought, what a great way to express this commitment I have to justice and equity in a way on the ground in a community that I know and love. And it was great until it wasn't. The district went through some leadership transitions, and I did not have confidence in the next wave of leadership. In fact, it went from really strong leadership to incredibly weak leadership. And so I fled. And not only did I flee, I was concerned that there wasn't enough candor about the weakness of the incoming leadership. And so I was very public in leaving and saying, this is not going to work. And after I left, I think there was significant turnover at the superintendent level for the next couple of years, because what I knew and what others knew bore out. So that was one time when I left consulting. And then there was another time when I learned from that, I have to be very selective about the roles I take. And I had a consulting project that turned into a job, and it was in global health. But designing and running a U.S. initiative on HIV, enlisting corporate community to partner with the public sector. And it was at the start of the Obama administration, and the Obama administration was creating the first comprehensive White House HIV strategy. And I got to be involved in shaping how the business community responds and partners. It was tremendous. We did some really cutting edge things like bringing together the city of Oakland's health department with Walgreens to help identify what are the most popular condom brands by neighborhood, because they have that data from their stores. And Young and Rubicam to help figure out what would a social marketing campaign look like. And we did a intercept survey to understand what are safer sex practices in Oakland. And Chevron did the analysis to help us write a report. It was so cool until it wasn't.
Yeah. I love
There was
that.
a lot of leadership issues. And I spent more time advising on the overall organization strategy than defending my program, and realized that this just wasn't a fit. And so after a couple of years, I left to go back to consulting and vowed I will not take another role until I'm 100% confident of the leadership. And I like consulting. I like the team that we've assembled. I like our clients. I don't see leaving that work anytime soon.
Yeah, doesn't sound like there's a reason to. But I love in your story that you have been compelled to make a change. Both, I would probably say now I've heard 3 stories where some part of you said, I'm going to try this, or I need to make a shift because I'm being called forward into something. And, things are great until they're not. And then you make another change. So,
Yeah, it sounds like was pulling you back to consulting. So every gig, pulled you back to consulting. And I've done that as well, where I get into, so I say I'm going to be a consultant, and then I find something compelling to work within. And I now have kind of shifted my mindset to say, these are all consulting gigs. They just happen to take 100% of my time, and I'm getting a W-2 at the end of the year. But that's what I'm there for. I'm not attracted to the day-to-day grind. I want to come in. I want to see transformation. I want to help them be better at their teams. And so I see that as kind of a through line for you, that, the consulting was always kind of at the base of what you were doing. And that's great.
I just wanted to add something that I learned about myself working for Congresswoman Lee, and I had reinforced working for the superintendent in Oakland and after, which is that at my core, I identify as a staffer. And that's the lens that I bring to consulting. I felt so blessed to be in rooms where Congresswoman Lee and the superintendent in Oakland were making really hard choices. And to be able to sit in that moment and provide what little advice, perspective I could, is just so humbling and is such a blessing. That is what motivates me to consult. It's not such an abstraction. It feels very much like being in the war room at these critical moments that can be for leaders so lonely and so hard, and trying to have their back. That is the way that I think about consulting. And I never, given what I know to be true of those moments, I don't need to be out front. What those leaders have to endure, and Barbara Lee suffered from death threats for years, real death, credible, verified death threats. I know that I don't have the stomach for that kind of work. I want to do everything I can to support the leaders who do.
I'm fascinated by this thread with what Juliet said and what you've now just said, because what came up for me immediately was identity, and how your identity can be a shaper, a bulwark of how you show up in the room. And so what Juliet was describing was, I think of myself as a consultant that happens to get a W-2. And that means, the way I interpret it, Juliet, is you show up with some equanimity to the problems. You aren't part of the system fully because you're holding this consultant perspective. You can get away from it and above it and look into it. And even though it's what you're describing, John, is a little different, you're also calling yourself a staffer puts you in a different relationship to the dynamic in the room. and you're very articulate. You get to be the person who has an outside perspective, who has the leader's back, and no ego about, I need to be the loudest voice in the room, or is this to be my idea that gets out front. So it's a really, both of you have kind of touched on some things that I think are really lovely about personal leadership and how you think about who you are in the room to be your most effective.
So I am so fascinated by the DEI world and working in DEI under this shit show that we're living in. It's really a struggle. And I want to hear about just how you got it started and the evolution of it and how you've navigated all the ups and downs.
Thank you for that question. I will try to be pithy, but I'll also try to do justice to work that people have been doing for centuries, because I think there's a risk of viewing the racial equity movement through the lens of the last, let's say, 10 years. And I'm going to say 10 years because we worked with a client recently who had done a study. They had comms consultants come in, and they studied whether they should use the language of equity or diversity in, I think it was 2018. And in 2018, the feedback was that equity wasn't a familiar enough term to use equity. And so we went from, in 2018, at least in some communities, an unfamiliarity with equity to, in 2025, equity being a dirty word. So it had in some circles, shelf life of 7 years. The good news is that there are people who have been doing equity work for decades. I chose the name Public Equity Group in 2006. But going back to college, I was a part of a group called Black and Queer at Stanford, Blacks. And we didn't use the language of intersectionality, but it was an organization at the intersection of Black and queer identity. I found a flyer I'd written for a training in 1995 when I was working at Stanford, and it was about how to work in communities of color in ways that were respectful and more, I think I used the word, I didn't use equitable, but more, I'm going to go with more respectful. But going even further back, I had the pleasure of going to a multicultural elementary school in the 70s. In many ways, the Harlem Renaissance was an intersectional movement of Black folk and women and queer folk. And let's not forget the abolitionists. Here in my town of Newburgh, we're doing a screening of the film version of Hamilton. And there's some controversy because the show is flawed in many ways. I didn't know Toni Morrison is a huge critic of the show because there were Black and brown folk playing white colonial roles without really changing the story and who it centers. Totally fair critique. That said, it is so refreshing to be reminded of founding fathers who were so vocal about abolition in 1776.
Yeah.
So we are in the next chapter of a movement that, and I didn't even include the civil rights movement in that retelling. We are in the next chapter of the same movement in a different container using different verbiage, and we will persevere. On the DEI front in particular.
How discouraged are you, John, with where we find ourselves and what's happening legally with policy in the country at this time? And at the risk of saying, don't get too political, because we try not to, we all lose our shit when we go down this path. But I really want to ask that question.
Sure. One of the things that I've come to realize is that we have just not focused enough on execution and delivery in communities, and especially low-income communities and communities of color. So what I mean by that is there are things that we have seen make a huge difference for people. Some of them are policies like the earned income tax credit, or even the child tax credits that we saw during the pandemic. They lifted millions of people out of poverty. They were discontinued and people fell back into poverty. Those things make a big difference. Too often, the changes people see are not in their own schools, neighborhoods, and such. We have a client, for instance, who's done a lot of work in a major city, and they and others have invested tens of millions of dollars in improving the downtown district. And the downtown district is notably better. You can point to lots of blocks, lots of buildings that now constitute a stronger downtown as a result. When asked about making similar investments in low-income communities and communities of color in neighborhoods, those were deemed too political, too difficult. And so you don't see those improvements on the ground in communities of color. And so we need to do a better job of actually delivering results for people on the ground. This is one of the vulnerabilities politically. So I was canvassing in 2024 and talked to a lot of African-American men who said, we got checks from the former president. And they could point to something that they believed impacted their pocketbook. And so we are not doing a good enough, despite best intentions, policies. There were a lot of formulas during the last administration intended to make investment more equitable, more climate friendly, more labor friendly. But it was hard to point to what that actually meant for people on the ground. Meanwhile, people could say, I got a check and I cashed that check and my life is better. And so we have to do a better job of executing for people, especially low-income people and people of color. The other thing I would say is that we often get trapped in conversations that are abstract about systems and policy and culture. And we know that we got into the mess we're in because of those things. The cumulative effect of slavery and all the laws that propped it up, including the US Constitution, and then Jim Crow and redlining, those systems and policies led to horrific results for folks of color, anti-immigrant, xenophobic legislation, and the like. So it's absolutely appropriate to diagnose those as root causes that drive bad outcomes. What we risk, though, is that we sometimes talk too much about systems without then connecting to results on the ground. And so we sometimes will talk only about systems. We are changing these policies. We are changing the way people meet, the way that funding flows. And we don't think enough about how that actually hits the ground. And then on the culture front, similarly, I don't know the right answer to whether we should rename everything that's named for a slaver or not. I honestly struggle with that. I doubt that renaming Washington, D.C. is the right answer. I doubt that that's going to have a real impact on people's lives. I worry about getting tangled up in such things when what people really want is to know that their incomes are improving, that they can send their kids to school, that they can get health care. So those are the things that I think we need to get better at. And it's just the nuts and bolts of delivery.
It sounds to me like the difference between what people are feeling and the larger work being done is, it's a short game and a long game. So the short game is the check. The short game is I can make a difference in people's lives and change how they think immediately if I do this one small thing that has no long-term effect, because those checks went to those folks and yay, it was a good policy at the time because we really needed to make sure people could put food on the table immediately. But what the policies of the last administration, Democrat administration, was to play the long game, to invest in infrastructure, to do things that are going to take 10, 20, 30 years for people to see the effects of. And then this current administration just came and reversed most of it because they had time. And I think that's really an incredible lesson. And what do we do about it?
Completely agree. I think it requires, to your point, both the short and the long term. And I think it requires, you might even say, a little bit of cynicism. I think we need to accept that people need to see change now. And sometimes that means putting cash out there, investing in improvements in neighborhood and community that build hope. Maybe that's not cynical, actually. Maybe that is not just practical, but real. I don't know that we paid enough attention to people's material need for incremental evidence of progress.
I think that's really important. I remember when I worked at the United Way, we went into West Oakland and had a conference there just to kind of show community leaders what was going on in West Oakland. And they had no grocery store, only corner stores. And it was the first time I, as a white woman growing up in middle class San Francisco, even understood that that was such an indicator of an impoverished neighborhood, is that there's no major grocery store investing in that neighborhood. Just the thought of not having the ability to get groceries at a reasonable price is that, feeding the poverty, keeping people in poverty. Just incredible.
Absolutely. And there's such an aversion to giving people money.
Yeah.
And there are times when that is absolutely the right thing to do. Just give people money. And this happens in countries all around the world. This is the part that can sometimes read as cynical. During election season, the coffers open and people are given money. And I'm not sure. I've always been a skeptic. I've always thought that was a form of manipulation and corruption. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder if we shouldn't just more often give people money. Just invest in communities where we know there's a need and not be attached to what comes next, as to your point, play the long game.
Yeah. So when are you running for office, John?
I hope never to run for office. I have such respect for the people who do and want to support the best folks who can and do and will. But I know myself. I'm too honest. I'm too. I don't mean that in a corruption sense. I'm too forthright. I'm too direct. I'm too impatient. I was lucky enough to meet Ron Dellums after he stepped down from Congress, and he was a very successful politician and obviously a hero for many of us, and led the anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. I appreciated his clarity that he was there to do a few things and only a few things. And I don't know that all of his constituents love that, but I had such respect for that. And so I could see if I were ever in elected office, I think I would displease a lot of people.
Again, with the directness and honesty.
And clarity. You're only going to do one or two things well. Do those one or two things.
Yeah.
I wish more people could just accept that and say that out loud and just call it what it is, because I think that is that would help a lot to manage expectations.
So we talked a bit about DEI in organizations, and this is another place where I think we risked alienating folks by focusing on some of the wrong things. And one thing I'll lift up, there was a lot of conversation over the last few years about white supremacy culture. And I will gladly discuss and debate how culture plays out in society. And there are things I would attribute to white culture, also Black culture, my own culture, queer culture, Latinx cultures, that culture is real. I think those are great conversations to have in the public square. I think that they are fun and relevant dinner time conversation. I don't think that they are productive in the workplace, where there's a risk of labeling one culture as problematic or undermining when the same could be said of other cultures. And so I think a growing recognition that if white is a race, as is Black or Latinx, race/ethnicity, to talk about white culture in a workplace in a derogatory way is not good, is not helpful, does not create cohesion. Even if the intention is to create a different kind of environment than the mainline business or organizational environment, why not just create a new environment? Why label it a white culture and that culture is flawed or fraud? Not helpful. So those are some of the things that I think we are learning in order to get to a more inclusive, equitable workplace that truly serves all of us, where we can be allies together in the work.
So it's kind of taking away the labels and the kind of not starting from a white culture, say, oh, this is the problem with our culture. And because it's white culture, we need to make a shift in the current culture. And what sounds like you're saying is, no, we need to take all culture out and kind of rebuild culture based on the people who are involved.
I'm not sure that I would take all culture out. I'm content to simply say we mustn't label culture as one thing, let alone white and bad, and that's why it needs to change. I've had this conversation with other folks where if you just diagnose the elements of an unproductive culture or a productive culture without labeling it racially, I'd like to think we could get to the same result. So if we think an office culture should not be top down, if we think there should be more active listening, if we think there should be more attention to less urgency, which is allegedly an attribute of white culture, then let's just discuss what kind of culture we want to have without attributing it to any particular group.
Beautiful.
Because there's a naivete is too kind. There's a narrowness to that lens. What do we make of organizations rooted in communities of color, led by folks of color? If we don't like aspects of that culture, is that also white supremacy? I've had people call CEOs of color white supremacist when they demand that work be done on time. I'm not sure whether that's, I don't even know how to diagnose whether that expectation that things be done on time emanate from upbringing in a white dominant society, or if we just need things on time because we know what the deadlines are. But labeling that as white and white supremacist is not helpful. There also are attributes of my own culture, as Black culture, queer culture, that someone might regard as problematic. And so the notion that only white culture can be problematic is also fraught. And so this is one of the places where I actually think having a more inclusive and sophisticated conversation in the workplace about race is needed.
That's great. An incredible lesson, and definitely is going to give our listeners a lot to think about.
Where do you find hope in this moment?
I think we're still doing the right work. The work we set out to do is still the right work to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that was true in the 1700s, and I think it's true in 2026. I think the rules of engagement are changing. In some ways, that's a given. In some ways, that's important and helpful. Many of the laws the anti-discrimination laws that protect us were written in the wake of the Civil War, and they were designed to protect Black Americans. And it is critical to protect Black Americans. It is also critical to protect Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. And I think as the workforce evolved and as the country grew and evolved, I think there was a recognition that we need anti-discrimination law to apply to everyone who's at risk. And that's a lot more folks of color and immigrants than just Black folk. And then in the modern era, there are times when, and I've been in debates with Black folk who will say it is impossible for Black people to be racist. And there's a naivete around that. There's some people who genuinely believe that. But there's also a systems analysis that if racism is really systemic and power is in white hands and not Black hands, then Black people can't engage in systemic racism. That's the more elaborate argument. But I've seen communities where Black folk come into power, and Frantz Fanon predicts this in writing about colonialism in Africa, where Black folk act as badly towards other folks of color, Latinos as an example, as white folks might have. And so power can corrupt. And so in that context, we need laws to protect Latinos, including from Black folk. I have also worked in organizations, I've consulted in organizations where there has been an anger directed towards white folks. And in those contexts, there are lots of white folks who, not lots, but there obviously have been white folks who have alleged discrimination. And I don't know the facts of each individual case. Some of them, given the political backgrounds of the folks filing those complaints, it's fair to question. But I have actually seen environments in which white folk have said that they've experienced, and I believe that they've experienced, a hostile environment. And so for that reason, it makes sense that our anti-discrimination laws should also protect white folk in the workplace. And so that is an evolution of our laws in a way that makes sense given the evolution of our society. So part of my acceptance of this moment is that our society is changing and the laws are changing and we must change. Now, that is all being weaponized in a way right now that is hideous and malicious and malignant. And that is terrifying. And they can be conflated, right? So it becomes really hard to have a subtle conversation about the evolution of society and the workplace and the need to protect more people in the context in which the government is alleging that there are mass attacks on white Americans to prevent them from getting jobs.
Yeah.
Right?
The nuance is lost. It just goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yeah, we end up having the wrong conversation.
Yeah. When you talk about your experience with kind of the over and under correcting DEI efforts. So Susan mentioned the word equanimity, and I feel like how do you advise organizations to continue the effort, whether there's funding for it or not, and keep that as their core value, which many people claim is, right? And many organizations do. And just how do you advise organizations to do it right, or as right as they can?
Somewhat simple answer. I was on a panel probably around 2021. It was a consulting careers panel. And one of the other firms on the panel described their racial evolution in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And ever since then, I've thought you shouldn't trust any organization or leader who came to realize that racism existed only in 2020. There are people who have been doing this work for centuries and for decades, and they continue to do the work, I think, with more resources and license and visibility between 2020 and 2024. They are now pivoting to continue doing the work in 2026. And I think those are the people to look to. There are companies all across America that have been in compliance with the law from go, continue to comply with the law, and continue to do really good, non-discriminatory, inclusive work. This environment is really difficult. The scrutiny, the confusion is high, and it's intended to deter and confuse. And so folks who really know what they're doing are able to continue heads down, maybe cross more T's and dot more I's, try to avoid the political fray. But for the most part, the things that folks were doing that was legal in 2023 remain legal in 2026.
We just have to remember that part. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in what's the headlines versus what's actually real. So that's cool. I have one more question for you, and you've mentioned many things already, but we love to have our guests give a secret, something they've learned along the way, a leadership secret, or just something that inspired them that they want to share.
I'm a big believer that the America that I want to be a part of, that I want to help build, is one where everyone is still at the table. We're just at the table in more equitable ways and more inclusive ways. The secret is it's actually more fun when everyone's at the table, and we're less angry, and we learn to tolerate some of the differences, some of the quiet parts we don't say out loud, and that's okay. we can still find ways to all work together. So that is one. And the last secret is we have to get better at delivering, not a secret, but we get lost. We have to get better at delivering results on the ground for people. We can get enticed by conversations about DEI and have we put the right policy in place? Are we using the right language? And people just want to know that their lives are getting better. And especially, I feel such a responsibility to help us deliver better results for folks of color, low-income folks, immigrants. I think we sometimes get lost. I think some of 2020 to 2024 got lost in the sauce. The Biden administration had all these really fancy rubrics for making decisions and ensuring the right people are at the table. And it was really hard for a lot of folks on the ground to see the results. And so I think we've got to focus. There are folks who are much better at focusing on getting money out the door onto the table. I think we have to do a better job of that. And then related to that, we've got to do a better job of measuring progress. And measurement is a lot easier than we think. Start by asking 10 people, is your life getting better? How and why? Then ask 100. Do interviews, do surveys, do focus groups. Start small, make adjustments. You don't need to do a randomized control trial.
John, thank you so much for being guest today. This has been an inspiring conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I know that. And I just thank you so much for making the time and the work that you do. And just, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, I've learned a lot. Thanks for the chance to do this. This is, like I said, I think a first or a second for me.
We're honored.
I'm honored. I'm honored to have been out. So, and Susan, great to meet you. Juliet,
Nice to meet you, John.
Connected.
Yeah, good seeing you. Thank you, as always, to our guests. Please stay with us for our post-interview takeaways.
I could have kept going for hours. He was so fun to talk to for me because he had this ability to be very cerebral about what it's obviously grounded in education, and he can talk about things from a 60,000 foot level. But at the end of the day, he was also very clearly guided by what he said was his heart. And so you get this sense of him sort of thinking, but then checking in with his gut and then thinking. And it just was really cool to watch him navigating his responses to our questions on multiple levels. I could almost feel it. I don't know. Did you have that sense as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't know how you do that with so much grace, it sounds like. And I can tell you from working with him directly, and it was, 10 years ago that we worked together, but just that's what he brought to the room. He brought, we talk a lot about order to chaos.
Yeah.
And that's what he that's natural. That's organic for him. He kind of sees the chaos and kind of can soften the edges of things and make it feel doable. Like he said, he just, he definitely gets in there and becomes part of the organization and puts everybody at ease. It's just so special.
I keep coming back to this theory that I have, or that I've been developing lately, which is how much a person's energy, frequency, composure, when they walk into the room is really what creates change. It's it's a theory I'm developing because I'm noticing sometimes people don't do anything. They just show up and suddenly the energy in the room shifts and people calm down.
Yes.
And they're more open. So what is that? It isn't someone coming in and saying, let's all take a deep breath, although sometimes that's helpful. Yeah. And people respond to the kind of presence and, again, equanimity and grace that someone walks into the room with.
Right.
And so there's a part of me that's like, okay, so leadership is about all these things, all this brain power that we bring to the table and constructs and frameworks, but it's also just about who we are in the room. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know where that takes us, but I just get the feeling that he could walk into any room and the change would be happening before he'd uttered a single word.
Well, and the respect that he brings to everyone in the room instantly. I mean, talking about having that everyone at the table. And that to me was just so powerful because we tend to think that DEI happens over there, and that, the equity and diversity conversations are about people of color or people who are marginalized, and it's like, no, if you want to have the conversation, what I heard from him was you have to have everybody at the table. And I love that he said it's more fun. That's really great. That's really great.
That's a great secret. And actually, even stopping and wondering, what is it that's fun about my job? Where does that joy come from? And I don't think a lot of people think about that.
Yeah.
As a way of tapping into, I call it juice. What gives you juice to do the next hard thing? And fun would be one way of talking about that.
Yeah, and being in a room with people who are all excited about making change happen and doing something different. And it may be, and we need all the perspectives to make change happen. So, and I like the other thing that he said in next chapter of the same movement, that we are in the next chapter of the same movement. And I want to keep that in mind. That is something I'm taking away, that this is not new work. It's hard and it's frustrating, but this work has been going on for a long time, and it'll continue to go on. And no one administration or one crazy person is gonna stop it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, and he brought this so vividly forward, is historically there have been ebbs and flows. This isn't the first time in history when the pushback has been so firm. And chaotic in this frame, but I think it was at other times too. And to remember that the work does continue in spite of the historical moment. But boy, it's hard. We don't live in history; we live our lives. And so to be able to come and say, imagine what it was like in 1776 or during the civil rights movement. I mean, we know what that was like. We see pictures. We have people talking about the pushback, the punishment for the changes that were afoot. So it's important to remember that then we made progress. Now we're going backwards again, and then we'll make progress again. So anyway, that was a really helpful part of our conversation with him. I could have talked to him much more.
Yeah, most definitely.
Maybe
we'll have to have him back. All right. With that, thank you, Susan. This has been another episode of Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. Please join us in 2 weeks for our next episode. And please rate us on whatever podcast vehicle you use. If you rate us and give us 5 stars, it helps other people find us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.
We're so glad you've joined us for this episode of Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please tell your friends and coworkers about us, and be sure to follow, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed listening. Secrets of the C-Suite is produced by Juliet Clothier, Susan Sutherland, and Brian Clothier. Original music is by Brian Clothier, and the podcast is inspired by leaders like you.